Welcome to Swift Fundamentals. Today, we will look at a new collection type called dictionaries. To begin, let's look at the other collection type that we know so far, which is an array. So let's say we have var myArray and set that equal to some numbers. Now we know that in the background, each one of these numbers or elements has an index associated to them, and they're always the same. So starting off what we have, we could say that this has an index of 0, then 1, and then 2, and so on and so forth for each element in the array. We can think of dictionaries as arrays that have specific unique index or indices that you set up, or in this case, they're called keys. So how does that look? We start off just like we would any other variable. Let's give it a name. And then let's annotate to see what's happening in the background. So it looks exactly like an array with the square brackets, but we have a colon in the middle to separate what the key type will be and what the value type will be. In this example, let's go ahead and write string. And let's say we'll associate strings to a value of int, because I want to create some grades. So actually, let's change this name to grades instead. And then let's set this equal to some sort of dictionary. So the key needs to be a string. So we'll say Alan, for example. We then write a colon to signify that this key is attached to some value. Now the value needs to be an integer as stated here. So let's say I got an 80. And then just like you would for multiple elements in an array, you separate each pair by a comma. So let's say we want to add another one. We'll say Alex, and then put a colon to separate the key and set the value to a 90. Because we control indexing in the form of keys, it allows us to organize data and understand the relationship between the pairs. Here we can model that the key is the student and the value represents the grade. Whereas if you try modeling this data in an array, you would have to make a mental note that, okay, index 0 represents student Alan and index 1 represents student Alex. And if you are another developer reading the code, you wouldn't know that unless you speak to the developer that wrote this, making it a very bad use of a data type. Dictionaries can also be referred to as hash maps. A map is basically created by two values by taking that key and hashing it into some index. Hashing is just basically an algorithm that takes that non-numerical value and turns it into a numerical value where the value, like for example, 80 gets stored at. There are two quirks that you definitely have to keep in mind when working with dictionaries. One is the keys must be unique, meaning that I cannot create another pair of, let's say, Alan set to some other grade. So let's try compiling this. And we see that we get an error. And that's because we have duplicate keys. Every key must be unique. And the other thing, which we'll see in a minute, is that dictionaries are not ordered. Meaning, even though you write it in a specific order, it does not mean that if you iterate through it, you'll get that same order. Before we move to iteration, let's look at how we can initialize an empty dictionary. So similarly to an empty array, there are two ways we can go about it. One is writing empty dictionary and just setting it to some sort of dictionary mapping of, let's say, int to string this time. And then simply equaling that to an empty box with a colon inside. If you do not have this colon, we will get an error because it treats it as an array. So this is what an empty literal looks like. And the other way is we can write empty dictionary 2, set that equal to, let's say this time a string is mapped to a string. And then we have our initializer, which is just the parenthesis sign. So both of these ways are forms of us declaring an empty dictionary. So now let's take a look at what iteration looks like. So let's add a couple more pairs inside our grades dictionary. We will establish that Mary got 100 and then Annie got an 85. And then for our iteration, it's just a simple for loop. So for grade and grades. And let's print out what grade is. And we see here that, as I said, the order is Alan, Alex, Mary, Annie. And what we got back instead was Mary, Annie, Alex, and Alan, actually in reverse. Or not even in reverse, no, because Mary, yeah, so just a mixed up order. To reiterate, dictionaries are not ordered and all keys must be unique. And something we see down here is that grade is taking the form of a tuple, which is just a variable that holds multiple values. So the first value here is key, and in this one it's Mary. And the second thing is holding the value and then some number. So we can say grade is a tuple of a string and an int. Now we can separate this if we want in our for loop by simply putting some parentheses and giving each one a specific name, something like key, comma, value, in grades. And then let's just print out, for example, just the keys. Let's comment this out and run this. And now we see that we get only the names of the dictionary, or the keys rather. These are not keywords. You could have written anything here. For example, you could put X and Y. And let's change this to X and it will still work. It's just now you're making an exact reference to what this value is called and what this value is called. So you can either work in pairs, such as we have an above here, or you can separate them to specific names. If you are going to separate them, I suggest you writing key and value just to keep in mind what you're working with. And it makes it easy to get exactly what you're trying to get out of your dictionary, such as the value, if you wanted only those, for example. But you are allowed to get an individual component of the pair, even when you have it the way I have it here. And you can specify by simply putting dot, and you see here that we get key and value. So this is yet another way of accessing a specific thing inside of this pairing. And yet another way that we can do it is using numbers, starting with 0, meaning the first thing. So this is another way of writing, get me the keys inside of this pair. And as you've probably seen, you can go ahead and rewind if you didn't quite catch it, but the values alternated every time that I ran this for loop. And that's because, to this first point, it is not ordered, and every time you do like a lookup, the order that you might get back is different every time. So you can't even be reliant on whatever order you got the first time, because they will change every time you iterate through the dictionary. Now moving ahead, dictionaries also have properties just like arrays do. So let's take a look at some of those. Let's call grades, and we can do a .count to get the amount of pairs that we have in our dictionary. So here we get 4 because we have 4 pairs currently. We can also check if our dictionary is empty, which in this case will yield us a false since it's not. And the next thing we want to check out is, how do we access a specific pair inside of our dictionary? Well, with arrays, we simply subscript an index, and here we're going to subscript with our key. So let's say we wanted to know, okay, how much did Mary score in this test? Let's say let result, or rather, let's just print it out directly. So let's print, we call our dictionary, we subscript it just like we would with an array, but instead of writing some sort of integer here, like 0 or 1, we put whatever the key is. So let's go ahead and write Mary and run this. we get an optional 100. Now, we saw optionals in our last lesson, and take a moment to think why you may get an optional here. Well, if you guess it's because we have an unlimited number of possible keys, that's a good guess. Think about it. We have string as our key, meaning that any sort of combination of string I could put in here. And how could the dictionary represent not having a pair? Well, that's by giving you a nil. For example, let's say I misspelled Mary and I ran this. Well, then I get a nil, which is appropriate for the fact that we do not have that pairing in our dictionary. So to combine our last lesson with this lesson, let's go ahead and unwrap this safely. So instead of just printing directly, let's say if let grade equals grades at Mar, then print out what grade is, else print grade doesn't exist. And if we run this, we can expect, we have a parentheses. If we run this, we see that we get grade doesn't exist. But if we change this to Mary, now we see that we get our 100, and that's 100 without the optional wrapping because we safely unwrapped it here using binding. Now, we can also update a pairing if we need to. So let's say we made a double check or somebody did some extra credit and now we have to change the grade. So we want to update Alex's grade. We simply just write grades, subscript it with the thing that, or the key that we want to update, such as Alex. Set that equal to whatever new value we want to set. So let's say now we said, what did he get? A 90, so now he has a 95. And to double check, once again, let's just go ahead and print out what grades Alex is. Obviously, I am not unwrapping it, so we're going to get that optional tag, and we see that we get optional 95, the new updated number that we've put in. Similarly, if we want to add a new pair, unlike using an append method or something of that nature, we just call grades, whatever key that we're trying to add. So let's say we're trying to do John, set that equal to whatever value that we're trying to have. So let's say another 90. And then let's just iterate through our dictionary to make sure all of the pairs are there. So for pairs in grades, let's just print out the pairs. And we see that John is now part of our dictionary. So much different from arrays where we have our append method. Here we can simply just call the dictionary, subscript it with the new key, and add a new value. To remove a pair, we have two options. The first is to call our dictionary, call the key that we're trying to get rid of, so let's say Alan, and set it to nil. So if we run this, we see that our for loop now doesn't have Alan. And the other way is simply calling grades, looking for remove value for key, and then we simply put the key we're trying to remove. So let's say Annie, and let's run this for loop. And we see now that all we have is Mary, John, and Alex. So two ways that we can get rid of a pair inside a dictionary. Lastly, I want to look at two more methods that are very useful from dictionaries. And this is a way of capturing all the keys or all the values in an array. So let's say we have a variable called keys equal to the dictionary and keys. And we want to wrap the entire thing in the array initializer, kind of like what we saw in array slices. And now we have an array of all the keys. Similarly, we can do that with values. Just write array and then grades dot values. And now we've captured all the values in an array. And you can iterate through these to check. So for key and keys, just print out those key. And we can see that we get Alex, John, and Mary. And same thing for values. For value in values. And then let's just print out those values. And we get the values there.